Hello everyone, I'm Nick from Boodskap. In this tutorial, we are going to see how to create workflows in the platform. Let's go to the platform guide and click on the workflow section. Workflow is nothing but a bunch of tasks executing either in sequence or in parallel, and helps you to manage complex business processes. The flow of the task can be determined using very simple if-else case statements using the workflow editor. Let's take a simple example. We will get the weather data for a particular location, and based on the temperature, alerts will be sent using SMS or email, or both SMS and email. In order to do that, we need to create a rule called process rules. Each task in the workflow is a process. While creating a workflow, we can distribute the tasks according to our needs, which we are going to see in a moment. In order to explain this workflow in depth, we have created a bunch of rules in the platform. Let me go over each rule one by one. First, there is a process called geocode. In this process, latitude and longitude are passed as input values. Then reverse geocoding is done using the Google Geocode API, and the output will be a valid address. Next, there is a process called weather. This also expects a latitude and longitude as input, and then it goes to an open weather map and fetches the weather data. We are interested only in the current snapshot, so we are skipping minutely, hourly, and daily data. This is going to return a variable called temp, which will have the temperature value of that particular latitude and longitude. Then there is a process called trigger notification. Here is where we set the trigger values and the notification method. Based on this, either email or SMS, or both SMS and email, will be triggered. Next, we are going to look at the trigger email process. Here we want to demonstrate a little bit more about the platform's internal data structures. You can see the grid context objects in the Context API. The platform has an internal distributed queue, and we can take leverage of that. So instead of directly sending the SMS or email, we are going to send it to a queue, so another process can take it and send it one by one. Imagine if you have hundreds and thousands of users triggering SMS or email or voicemail, the process may stall. Effective queue processing will give you much more flexibility to handle large volumes of data. Similarly, for trigger SMS, we are using an SMS queue and pushing the data to the queue. Trigger both process does the same thing. It pushes the data to the SMS queue and the email notification listener queue. Now let's take a look into these two job rules: email notification listener and SMS notification listener. What it does is, it listens on a queue as long as the job is running. As soon as the data comes in, it is going to invoke another rule called email sender and pass the data to the queue. This is a named rule. So do we have to do this? No, we are just trying to explain how to augment the code for easy readability. That's why we keep the logic in different rules. Email sender is one of the named rule, and the SMS sender is another, where you are passing the data and invoking the rule. As of now, the email sender and SMS sender will just log the data into the console. Here is where we need to put the logic of actually contacting a third-party API and push the data through email, or SMS, or voicemail, or by any other communication channel. Finally, let's see the message rule. This is where your sensor sends the data. Multiple workflows can be defined in the platform. But each and every workflow needs to be started based on some input. In our case, the workflow is called weather_forecast. As soon as the latitude and longitude comes in, we are starting the workflow. This is the workflow context, and you could see it here in the documentation. Workflow has a lot of different methods and is shown here. You can start a workflow, restart, resume, pause, stop, update the input, and metadata on the fly. So coming back, if you are not sure about message rules, there are a lot of other tutorials where you can see how to send the data to the platform using MQTT, UDP, and so on. Alright, let's quickly go and create all this process first in the platform. Go to the platform. Click on Rules Engine. Go to the process rules. I am adding a process called geocode process. Here is where you need to be careful. In order to design a proper workflow, you need to declare the output properly so the flow diagrams can be dragged and dropped in the workflow editor effectively. In this case, the output is address, and it is of type string. You can tag and group your process for easy searching and filtering. I'm naming the group as tutorial and saving it. Let me copy this geocode process code and paste it here. Very similarly, I'm going to go and create all the other processes. The geocode process has an output of address as string. The weather process has an output of temp, which is float. The trigger notification has an output of none, both SMS and email of type Boolean. Trigger email, trigger SMS, and trigger both processes has output as status, which is Boolean. Now let's go and create these job rules, email notification listener and SMS notification listener, in the rules engine. Let's also create these two named rules, email sender and SMS sender. Finally, let's create the message rule, weather forecast. Let's go to the Workflow Studio and create the actual workflow. Let's add a new workflow called weather forecast. And I'm going to say the group name as tutorial and give some description. Right now, we only have these 6 processes. It's easy to select. You can also filter by groups. Now, we select all these processes. Using this Workflow Studio, easily you can create any kind of complex workflow. In this tutorial, we are going to see a very basic version of workflow. And we will have several parts of the same tutorial to cover the workflow engine in depth. First, let's take the geocode process. And this is the entry point of our flow. So as soon as the workflow starts, the geocode process will kick in. Next, we are going to put in a condition for checking the address. If for some reason the latitude, longitude cannot find any address, we are going to skip the flow. Return null not equal to address. Very simple expression. The green dot is the true condition, and the red dot will be the false condition. So in true condition, I'm going to invoke the next task called the weather process. On the false condition, I am going to terminate the workflow. So now, the weather process should actually call the trigger notification. You can put a conditional statement and write any complex expression here. For example, you can create an expression saying that if the temperature is above a certain value, invoke another process or any other controls. In our case, I'm going to skip this conditional statement and introduce another control called onComplete. We don't care what the temperature is at this point. As soon as this task is complete, I am going to invoke the trigger notification. In the trigger notification, I'm going to put 4 conditions. So first condition, if none, we're going to stop the process. You have to save all these intermediate expressions when creating it. If none, return equal to true, then we are stopping the process. If both are true, then we are calling the process trigger both. Similarly, let's go and create the conditions for SMS and emails. I'm calling the SMS process here. I'm calling the email process here. Now we can save the workflow. Before we even use the rules engine to start executing this workflow, we can test it manually from the workflow editor. In this case, I'm going to give latitude and longitude some random values and see what happens. Let's go to the workflow instances. The weather forecast workflow is complete, and only one process got executed. The workflow actually terminated, and the reason is that, on given latitude and longitude values, there was no valid address found. Now let's give a valid input. Let's go to Google and find the latitude, longitude of London. I will start the workflow again. Let's go to the instance. Then to the workflow weather forecast. We can see 4 steps have been processed. Now, let me walk you through this detailed report of workflow. This dashboard is very elaborative and gives you the details of everything that went on in the workflow. This will be very useful when dealing with a lot of production workflows. In this case, you can see the input came as lat, lon. There is no metadata, there are no messages in this workflow. You could see the geocode process is finished. It ran for 0.45 seconds and it outputted the address. The weather process kicked in, and the result is the temperature of 10.82. The triggered notification started. And because of the logic we had written, if the temperature is less than 35, we skip it. In our case, the temperature is 10.82 and no notifications are sent. And finally, the stop has been called. This explains the entire flow. Now let's go and change the process so that we can trigger a notification. Let's go to trigger notification rule. If the temperature is greater than 40 or if the temperature is less than 15, I'm going to trigger both the SMS and email. I'm saving this. Let's take the same input and start the workflow. Go to workflow instance. This time, we see the process trigger both have been executed. When you look at the trigger notification flow, trigger both has become true. This gives you full freedom of creating a workflow the way you want. When you are dealing with a lot of production use cases, you can create n number of workflows. If your IoT sensors or devices push data, based on the data, you can create several workflows and have the entire business processes separated from the actual code. So again, one last thing. Let's go to the message rule and start the same workflow and see what happens. 1001. This is the actual sensor message. I'm going to simulate a latitude, longitude. This time let's use Dallas. Give the values here. Let's now go and look at the workflow instance. This is the last executed workflow. If you look at the input, you see latitude and longitude. Geo process returned an address in Dallas. And the weather process returned a temperature of 22. In this case, 22 is a safe temperature. And no trigger should be invoked. Yes, none is true and finally got stopped. In this tutorial, we have seen how to create a simple workflow in the platform. That's it for now in this tutorial. Please visit our website and learn more about the platform capabilities. Thanks for watching.